Okay, this is our last session. Last, but before the debate, this is our last session. The last panel before the debate. No, I knew about the debate. We're getting tired. Last but not least, I should say, because it's going to be very exciting, and we're going to spice things up with this session. So I'm going to present the moderator, and the moderator will present the speakers, and we'll get on with it. So Allan Chochinov is the chair of the new multidisciplinary MFA in the Products of Design program at the School of Visual Arts in New York City. And he's also a partner of Core 77, who many of us know, and writes for the blog and leads it in a very, very creative way. Prior to this work, Allan's practice in product design focused on the medical, surgical, and diagnostic fields, working on projects for clients from Johnson & Johnson to Federal Express, which is really interesting, and I'll tell you why in a second. Back when it was called Federal Express, he has been named on numerous design and utility patents and speaks, moderates, and teaches around the world at venues from the Aspen Design Conference to the Rockefeller Center at Bellagio, and now today at MIT, and he's very excited. I asked him, what should I say that's interesting? He said, I'm very excited to be here today at MIT. And I have to say, I got to know Allan through Paula, of course. And the first talk I've watched of yours was an IJA talk, I believe it was from 2011, when you talked about a whirlwind tour, enterprise of design through the lens of the bathroom. And then all these patents that you have. So Allan is just a very, very, very exotic mix of talents, and has an amazing ability to observe and to critically review the state of contemporary design. So I'm sure this will be as critical as it is humorous, because he always also has an amazing sense of humor. And I would just like to say that my hope for the panel and for this last, not last session, but the last panel session, is that we tackle the panel is called complexity, and that we tackle knottiness, and this is what I think we're going to do in the panel, tackle the matrix, the space that exists between knottiness and complexity. And if knottiness is the X and complexity is on the Y, there are products or objects that are highly complex, but not knotty at all, like our T-Rex from yesterday. And then, and then there are projects that are incredibly knotty and very simple. So I'd love to not forget the knottiness in knotty objects as we talk about complexity, and would love to see how you do it. So join me in welcoming Allan. Thank you so much.
I think we're okay. Do you want to come up? Do you have the remote?
Yes.
Be great. Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to be here. This is Scott and Fernanda, and I'll introduce them properly in a little bit. So I may have taken a bit of a mistaken turn with this presentation. Knotty objects, right away in my mind went to a different place. So this is a banana saver. This is another model for, larger bananas. Beats are in the news, and also Minions in the news. I was there opening day, just was there. And then this I actually think is kind of clever. So there's my knotty objects, and I realized, well, maybe this isn't what they're asking for. They might be asking for this. So this is called tatting. It is hand lace making. Some people call it the poor man's lace, which I resent. And so I've been doing this hobby for about 3.5 or 4 years, and last winter I thought that I would write about it. And so I wrote an article called 52,000 Knots, One Man's Journey into the Craft of Tatted Lace. I wrote it on Medium, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with Medium, Medium does sort of a cute little thing on the bottom where they tell you how many minutes it takes you to read an article, which at first I thought was kind of terrible, and now I think is kind of sweet. Anyway, so this is a 25-minute article written by a guy learning how to make lace. So not a blockbuster. Although I have to say, on Super Bowl Sunday weekend, there were 10,000 views. So, you know, take that NFL or something. Okay, so the other thing that I do in the article is I show this piece of tatting. So the article took like 3.5 months to make, and the piece that I feature as sort of this narrative device that you see the piece getting bigger and bigger through the article also took about 3.5 months. So there's that. And in the piece, I actually count up the knots at each stage, so you can tell. So here's like a close-up of this piece, and at this point it's 4,246 knots. Okay, so how is this done? So this is Karen Cabrera, the absolute queen of tatting on the internet. I learned this via YouTube. Let's let her get up to speed here. Okay, so mesmerizing and mystifying, and I had absolutely met my match. My thing is like learning how to do stuff with my hands, and I was just like, oh, I don't know. This one looks kind of tough. And so essentially you have 2 threads, and you have 2 shuttles, and you're using 2 hands and 10 fingers, and everything has to orchestrate just so. There's kind of a gas and clutch activity that goes on that I'll tell you a little bit more. Here's a more classic view. So there's, this is how you feel, or you want this, and Neri, I actually put this in for you. I thought, yeah. So like maybe this would help or something. And so here's me doing it. So let me get up to speed. So this is actually like after a few years. And so you can see this piece of lace that's emerging from my pinched left index finger and thumb. So it's very slow, very painstaking. Yeah. So there's an ergonomic complexity to this because everything has to be positioned just so, and it has to actually work just so. But it actually gets worse because of the flip. And the flip is described, well, you think that you're actually tying one knot around another string when it's actually the string that you're tying the knot around that's tying the knot. So that is as clear as I can make it. This takes a long time to understand and a way longer time to do. So I'm going to let...
I have the white thread wrapped around the red thread.
If you can just bump the volume a little bit.
I don't want that.
You don't want that.
I want the red thread to be wrapped around the white thread. So in order to fix that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to relax my left hand and tighten up my right hand. Did you see the knot flip over?
I'm going to burn 10 more seconds so you can see it again. All right.
So here I have the white thread wrapped around the red thread. I'm going to relax my left hand and tighten up my right hand. And the red thread is now wrapped around the white thread.
Okay, so I've watched this video, I don't know, 600 times. This is completely counterintuitive. And the sort of biggest problem, if this weren't hard enough, these are real knots. So for those of you who do knitting and crocheting, you know that if you make a mistake, you just pull the yarn because they're slip knots. These are actually, for all you knot enthusiasts, half hitches, which together make cow hitches, and you have to actually pick them apart. And so it's one thing to take apart an errantly made knot out of rope. It's another thing to take it apart out of 2 pieces of string. I mean, really thread. When your hands are cramping up and you're watching this video about the flip, trying to understand like what the hell is going on here. So this translates into basically 5 nights of crying. And this is why nobody does this hobby, because it is like almost impossible to make it through that first week. And if you make it through the first week, and I want you to email me when you do, I can promise you years of pleasure after that, but almost nobody makes it through the first week, and almost I didn't. Okay, so 15,000 knots, getting bigger here. All right, so there are hundreds of flavors and colors of tatting thread. This is the same pattern top and bottom, but you can see that the colors are reversed, so there's an interesting figure ground thing going on there. This is what a tatting pattern looks like. By the way, everything is attributed on this article. I should have subtitles here. This community is very fussy about people designing patterns and getting credit for them, so that's where the credit is for all this. So you can see that this pattern, you can see it's like rings and chains and rings and chains. So this pattern makes this piece, which I was very proud of. But of course, I like complicated Japanese patterns because I like doing things the hard way. And I don't read Japanese. Yeah. Okay, so there's for me like a simplicity, complexity, which I thought I was coining a term today, simplexity, which I was super proud of, except that there's a book called Simplexity, which I have not read. Okay, so 22,000 knots. This is a surgical, so I come to this hobby pretty honestly. So this is, as Neri said, my background is in surgical medical device design. I really love that stuff. I really miss it. So this is a surgical knot pusher where you tie a knot outside the body and you push it down, typically into the femoral artery. Sorry, this is not my patent. And so this is a femoral artery with a bullet in it, also not my bullet. And there's just no way to tie a knot like inside there, so you have to tie it outside and push it down to the body. And so the project got killed, but not after I really, fell in love with string and suturing and tying knots and, tiny fussy things. So that's how I came to it. But the tatting, sort of what tatting looks like from the outside is this. So it's basically grandmothers. And ironically, or not, I actually learned the first time I was exposed to tatting was outside at like a county fair with two grandmothers. So this is, and this was I found on the internet. And this is the kind of products that tatting makes. So there's a weird thing there. This is Renoir painting 110 years ago called Girl Tatting. She's now a grandmother, or long grandmother. Here's me accidentally walking in front of this painting at the Philadelphia Museum with my wife and daughter with a piece of tatting in my pocket. So my daughter took this photo that we staged, so that was lucky. So there's a weird sort of gendered complexity around this thing. 33,000 knots. And so, here's some tree ornaments and earrings, but basically these things are completely useless, right? You do them because mistakes are so expensive that you have to concentrate so hard that you don't want to make a mistake, so you can't worry about work, basically. Because you're just you're in there, right? And so they're motifs and they're patterns, and you just make them, and they take a really long time. So this is a piece that I was really proud of. Here I made it black and white on Instagram or something. I don't know, it's just completely meaningless. This is in the shape of a picture frame, but you couldn't put a picture in there because it has no structural integrity because it's made of thread, right? This on top is a picture from a book that was going to be one day I'll be able to tat this pattern. That was the goal for me when I started, and there it is down on the bottom. Congratulations to me. And these are shitty drink coasters because they're filled. They won't protect a table because they're filled with holes, right? And they won't even protect themselves because they are made of cotton. And so if you spilled coffee on them, you would stain them, right? So I have tons of these things. I literally have a pile of them at home, right? I don't give them away so much because, I don't know, there's just hundreds of hours in them and stuff. And this is important because the question that everybody asks me when they see me doing this is, well, what is it going to be? And I really have to come clean because it's not going to be anything, right? It is a doily, right? And so I wrote, there's no way around it. I make doilies, right? And then I sort of editorialized around in the article, there are only so many horizontal surfaces in any one home, and frankly, one or two doilies in any house is probably quite enough doily, so there's not much I can do with them, so hence the piles. Okay, so there's a utilitarian complexity, and maybe for me an ontological complexity, and 41,000 knots. I'm trying to look here and here. So finally, there's a social or interpersonal complexity, because question number 2 always is, well, how do you have the patience for that? And of course, that is the only question that you can't ask, because anyone who does any kind of handicraft, you're actually kind of sad at the end when you finish it, right? Finishing is not the goal. It's kind of a bummer, and you're looking for the next project. And that is always followed by this question, which is, well, I'd never have the patience for that. To which I'm silently in my mind thinking, it's well, I never dared you to have the patience for this. And one day I'll actually say that out loud and be a little bit rude. I'm not sure. So here we are, 50,680 knots. So this does not equal 52,000 knots because I gave myself a margin of around 1,400 knots that were mistakes. They had to unknot, so it should probably be more than 52,000. So just to remind you, this is where we started, this is where I ended, and thank you for having the patience for this. Yeah. Okay. All right, so I gave you a bunch of colloquial complexities in that 7 minutes, and Scott Page is going to give you some more specific scholarship language, some academic language, and really some scientific language. So Scotty Page is the Leonid Hurwitz Collegiate Professor of Complex Systems, Political Science, and Economics at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And an external faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute. He is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a Guggenheim Fellow. Wikipedia adds that he's best known for his research on diversity, complexity, and modeling the social sciences. His specific research includes path dependence, culture, collective wisdom, adaptation, and computational models of social life. So this is going to be very good. He also teaches through a video series called Understanding Complexity and a Coursera online course called Model Thinking, which is awesome because I've watched one of them. It's pretty great. Please welcome Scott E. Page.
Thanks. It's great to hear. Allan did a fabulous job setting this up for us, this panel, and he told us he's going to make us seem really practical. So I want to thank him for that. Because usually I seem very impractical. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the field of complex systems from a somewhat scientific perspective. 25 years ago, this place was founded called the Santa Fe Institute. It was meant to be this sort of center for complexity studies. And at the time, Michael Cohen sort of described it as a festival of bad metaphors. You know, people would talk about things like the edge of chaos and emergence at the edge of chaos and that sort of stuff. In the intervening years, what's happened is it's actually become almost like a real science, which is pretty cool. So what I'm going to do is I want to sort of talk about that science, but I'm actually going to use maybe a few metaphors just to make it make sense. But I want to start by making a distinction between complexity and complicated. So the previous panel, we talked about manufacturing. And manufacturing is complicated. So what you've got is you've got these diverse parts, but they're in a fixed interaction structure, and you know what they're going to do. So if you look at a watch, this is complicated, right? There's diverse parts, they're interconnected. When one part takes an action, interacts with another part, but we know what it's going to do. When we build a ship, it's the same sort of thing. It's a very complicated thing, but it's not complex. Now, there's a sense in which we've solved complicated. I don't mean by that that we've solved every single complicated problem out there. What I mean is that we've solved some complicated problems. Because what we do is we know the laws of physics, right? And we know some laws of biology. And so we can construct elaborate machines or watches or iPads or things like this that do amazing things. And if you set up this exact same experiment the exact same way 1,000 times, the exact same thing will happen each time. When we think about complex systems, they're different. Complex systems have diverse parts, but there's three fundamental differences. The first fundamental difference is the interaction structures change, right? A week ago, I didn't know Allan. Now he's like my best friend. We make doilies together on the weekends, right? So the topology changes. But the other thing is the parts, the big thing is the parts adapt, right? They change. When I look at a carbon atom, I gave a talk in our physics department a couple weeks ago, and I put up one carbon atom, then I put up another carbon atom, then I put up another carbon atom. They're all the same. Then I started putting up pictures of Fred Adamses, because one of the physicists was a guy named Fred Adams. And all these Fred Adams are different. And you don't know what one Fred Adams is going to do on any given day or in any given situation. And then the third thing is that we have in these complex systems what we call emergent phenomenon. So people have talked about the sum being more than the parts. Here I'm talking about knotty objects. But in complex systems, we actually have a different phrase, which is due to Philip Anderson, the Nobel Prize winner in physics, called more is different. And the idea is this, that the aggregate has functional properties that cannot exist at the level of the individual part. So an individual neuron can't have cognition. An individual neuron can't have consciousness. An individual neuron can't have a weird personality, right? But collections of them can, and it's that more is different. It's this sort of aggregate functionalities that can exist at the micro level that we find really interesting. So when I say this has become a science, we've actually got tons and tons of mathematical measures for what we mean by complexity. And one set of them falls under what I call sort of Bohr measures, which is between ordered and random. So something like a watch that's mechanical, which is completely ordered, isn't complex. Something that's completely random isn't complex either. When you say complex, it's sort of between ordered and random. So when you look at economic data, that's not random, but it's also not ordered. It's boring, right? So it's complex. Okay? When we talk about emergence, we talk about microphenomena that can't exist at the micro level, right? So when you think about this pattern, right, this is what we would call self-organization in the doily. So there's an organized pattern that emerges that couldn't exist at the micro level. But we actually have this happen in rule space. So there's this thing called Conway's game of life, where you set this up artificially on a checkerboard. Squares can either be alive, painted black, or dead, just left white. And each square has 8 neighbors. And there's a rule which is if you have more than 3 neighbors alive or fewer than 2 neighbors alive, you die. If you have 2 or 3 neighbors alive, you stay alive. And if you have exactly 3 neighbors alive and you're dead, you come to life. So mother, father, midwife, you come into being sort of thing, right? Well, here is Conway's game of life being played out. So you start with very simple rules, and yet at the macro level, you get these amazing patterns. But here's the subtlety. Here's what's so cool about complex systems. On the one hand, you could say, cool patterns, we might make some doilies that look like that, right? But what it turns out you can show.
Doilies 3 times in
I know.
a sentence. That's
I'm getting $10 every time I say doilies to Matt. So that's why he's bitter about this. But we'll stop at $100. So the thing is, these patterns, it can be shown mathematically, can actually do any computation. So the game of life is a universal computer. So it's interesting that very simple set of rules can actually produce a universal computer. And this is where we get this idea that Ed Fredkin calls sort of it from bit. The idea that the collective can do these functional things, even though the parts are really simple. Now it's interesting, and this has sound. I didn't know it had sound, so this is pretty exciting. Can you turn off the sound? So these are starlings, right? Now there's no lead starling telling everybody where to fly, right? They're following very, very simple rules. And ecologists have actually studied this, and we can write down the rules that birds follow, and we can actually have computer models that predict and demonstrate this sort of aggregate behavior. But again, these really magnificent patterns are emerging at the macro level from individual things following very simple rules. There's no coordinator, and yet we share these beautiful, beautiful things. Okay, so when we think about human systems, we have complexity, but it's not quite so beautiful. So I'm reminded of the Digitopoulos, or Digitarians. Digitopoulos is the phantom toll booth slipping up. This is traffic in India. This is actual real traffic. And what you see is this is incredibly complex. It's somewhat productive, right? But it doesn't have any of the beautiful patterns that the starling have. And that's because of the fact that people are so adaptive. We're constantly changing. So when I think about complexity in this way, there's another whole set of definitions which I call deep. So when we say something's complex, we mean that it would be something that would be really difficult to evolve, like the brain, to engineer, to explain, or to predict. And so if you think of something like there was once this thing called Concept Los Angeles, the idea that Los Angeles would be this sort of hub of micro cities with transportation districts between them. Somebody lays out that plan, but the thing is, people decided not to do that. They decided to make this messy, interesting, complex Los Angeles that doesn't look like the plan. So when people like myself or social scientists think about complexity, we don't think about designing it. We don't think like sort of manufacturing a plan that turns out perfect iPods. We think about harnessing complexity. We think about sort of turning the dials of adaptation and diversity and things like that to make the systems work. Now the interesting things as I finish up here is these systems aren't entirely lawless. One thing that comes out of them is we get a lot of sort of long-tailed behaviors. So you can see things like heart rate versus body size lies on this sort of log-log plot, as does the speed at which people walk as a function of city sizes. So the bigger the city, the faster people walk. So complex systems have these inherent patterns. The other thing about them that's really interesting is they're incredibly robust. So if I take this watch and I pull out one part, it doesn't work. If I open the hood of your car and rip out a wire, it's not going to work. But if you're in the media like Bob Woodruff, you can have a quarter of your brain taken off and you can still work, right? Because the brain is this plastic thing, right? And it adapts and it survives. So this amazing robustness of complex systems is something we work on. This is the Northridge earthquake, right? So it almost looked like strategic bombing in LA, and I was living in LA at that time, and things worked fine. I mean, the economy just went on just perfectly fine the very next day. So these systems are very robust. I just want to end with two thoughts. So we'll, hopefully we'll get up in the discussion. And that is this: when we think about these complex systems from a harnessing perspective, or possibly a design perspective, there's two things that I think we need to keep in mind. One is complexity is good. So this is work by Cesar Hidalgo here at MIT with Ricardo Hausman at Harvard. If you plot just a crude measure of economic complexity and you look at income or growth, they're positively correlated. The more complex the economy, the better off people are. But the other thing, when you think about these complex systems, there's something that physicists call breaking symmetry. In order to get this sort of amazing things, different neurons have to do different things. Different ants have to do different things. So here what we're going to see is these ants are going to form a bridge. And when these ants form a bridge, some of them are stuck sort of being the bridge. Others of them get to walk across the bridge and have a really jolly good time. One of the things we want to think about when we construct these complex systems is, what is the distribution of resources going to look like? And one of the sort of sad things that we find from complex systems, if you look at things like species area laws, there's a lot of big winners and there's a lot of big losers. And so when you think about harnessing complexity, that's one thing we want to think about. And then the last thing I sort of want to throw out is this idea of the brain. When we think about the ramp up between what the brain can do and what a neuron can do, it's amazing. So the ability of complex systems to be more than the parts is just totally astounding. And yet when we think of sort of what we've been able to do collectively compared to what we can do individually, that ramp up isn't that large. So I think there's amazing potential in complexity if we can figure out how to harness it. Thank you.
Scott. Many of you are going to be familiar with Fernanda's work. This is, well, we're going to make all this stuff go next, right? Yeah. So we've heard the term aesthetics used a few different ways today, actually. And I think that there are limits to beauty as an objective in design. Maybe we can get into that a little bit. The stuff that you do is just absolutely beautiful. And captivating in that way. And if beauty is useful, at least in a repeatable way, it's to get people to say yes, like, wow, like, what is that? And so when I look at your work, I'm like, wow, like, what is that? And then as I start to peel that layer back and understand what it's actually representing and how live it is, the payoff is extraordinary for me. Anyway, excited that you're here. I first became aware of the two of yours work in 2007 when I saw you present at a conference on service design at Carnegie Mellon, back when service design was not a term. It was a naughty term. It was a radical idea, actually, in this country anyway. Fernanda Viegas is a Brazilian scientist and designer whose work focuses on the social, collaborative, and artistic aspects of information visualization. With Martin Wattenberg, she co-leads Google's visualization research group in Cambridge. Fernanda uses data visualization to reveal arresting, unintuitive patterns in data sets ranging from the social to the natural world. Her artistic work has been exhibited around the world and is part of the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art. She has a PhD and an MS from the Media Lab. Please welcome Fernanda Viegas.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, so when I knew that we're going to talk about design and complexity, I started thinking very hard about what projects to show. And I chose two very different projects. One that Martin and I did a long, long time ago, the first project we ever worked on together, and one that we did more recently. So bear with me as I move back in time a little bit. So I want to talk about Wikipedia. And this is back in 2003, when most people didn't even know what a wiki was and how it worked and what people were writing together an encyclopedia. That's crazy. And we were interested in trying to understand what the dynamics were of the website. How are people coming together and collaborating? And so what we did is we started looking at the articles themselves and then realized that behind each article on Wikipedia, there was a page with all the history of edits. So it's sort of like a log, right? That for every time someone touched and saved and edited that page, there was an entry there. And that's what we decided. Yes, this is what we need to visualize. It's all this information here. And these pages get extremely long. There are hundreds of thousands of these. So it seemed like visualization would be a good way to start tackling the dynamics of this. And so what we did is we created a new technique. And I'll walk you very quickly through how it works. Imagine you have 3 people working on the same article, on the same document, okay? And I'm giving each person a color. And then I'm saying, okay, version 1 is represented by a single line, and it takes Mary's color. It's in orange there. That's everything that Mary wrote. So the length of the line is the length of the article. On version 2, Suzanne in blue comes around and says, I'm going to add a little paragraph to the end. So there's a little bit of blue to the end, right? And then some people, version 3, something gets cut off. So you see the line shrinking. There's a little bit of green there. So these are just the changes that happen from version to version. To make things even more clear, what we do is we connect every time there is a snippet of text that survives intact. So whenever text survives, it gets connected by these colors, okay? And then you can see little holes in the middle of the diagram, and that's when text is inserted or is deleted. Now, I'm showing everything here equally distanced from version 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. But we can start to play little games where I show the same data in real time, and then you start to see rhythms. And I'm saying, oh, between version 1 and version 2, there was a lot of time, and then version 3 came off right away. And then I can also make these things interactive where I can highlight version 4, and I can show right next to it the actual text, right? So you can actually read the article as we move along. So now let me demo for you. This is called history flow. So this is the diagram of the article on design, seemed appropriate. And I have a little wand here that I'm moving, and as I'm moving from one version to the next, you can see the text on the right changing, okay? Over here on the left is all the people who have edited this article, and on the top, if you can read it, I'm not sure you can, there is the comments, if people chose to leave any comments. So design is okay, but not super exciting. Let's go to cat, because cat is always interesting. So you can see right away that more people care about cats than they do about design. And there's a lot more versions of cat. And then there's interesting things going on with this diagram. For instance, at the top here, there's a very stripy pattern. And that happens to be this table that someone added with the kingdom for cats and the class and the order and the family and species and so forth. And then we see other interesting things like this sort of antenna at the bottom, all in white, and you may wonder what's going on there. So if I just bring the visualization over there, what happens is I see a whole sequence of paragraphs that were added here that have to do with the Unix command cat, okay? Obviously, this is a page about actual cats, not about computer commands. So what happens next? Did someone just delete the whole thing? Well, if I go to the next version, I can see that it didn't just get deleted. If you could read it here, you would see that someone just redirected that topic to a new page called cat Unix. Okay, so this is exactly the kind of dynamics that we started to get interested in. How are people negotiating what belongs or doesn't belong on a page? So with that, let me bring you to another example. So this is the page on abortion. Anything jumps at you here? Is there anything different here? Anyone? Everything gets deleted. Because you see these black gashes, right? That's exactly what happens. I have a really long article here, and then boom, it gets deleted. This is vandalism. We all know it happens on Wikipedia. This is called mass deletion. Over here, someone not only deleted, but said abortion is great, and then said abortion is good, and then it got fixed. But the interesting thing, we knew vandalism was happening, but the interesting thing was that at the bottom here, it tells me the timestamp of when this mass deletion happened. So it happened on the 17th of December at 4:06, and it got fixed on the same day at 4:07. So it took a minute to get fixed. And this is something that we started seeing over and over again, and we just couldn't wrap our minds around how this was happening. And so we just talked to Wikipedians and realized that there's something called a watch page where you can sign up to get notifications whenever someone edits the page you're interested in. If I visualize the same data in real time, you don't even see the gashes because they get fixed so fast. And then the final version, I want to show the final example here, is chocolate. So this is the edit history for chocolate. It looks very pink, but no special anything, except that this is in real time. So now this is actual version by version. Anyone wants to guess what the zigzag is? Yes, an edit war. Yes, exactly. Back here, someone put, this person, Daniel Boyer, put this small paragraph that says, extremely rarely, melted chocolate has been used to make a kind of surrealist sculpture called collage. It survives, it's this white piece. It survives for a while, and then someone comes here and says, removing Boyer invention. Well, he comes back and says, reverting, collage is not a Boyer invention. Google search for chocolate coulage finds only Boyer. Reverting, leave your humbug out, leave reverting, and so on and so forth. So he gives up eventually, which is sad because Martin and I did a search and chocolate coulage does exist. But life goes on Wikipedia. The last thing I want to show is when you get rid of all the author colors and you just color by age, so the older piece of text is there, the darker it is. It serves as a proxy for quality, right? And you can see that actually there's quite a lot of high quality text apparently in this article. So one of the things about complexity that I think is fascinating about this work is when Martin and I created this technique, we had no idea what these images would be like. And in fact, we had no idea if we would see any patterns at all, because it is complex, right? Because it's a complex system with independent agents. And the fact that there were some patterns that you could see, and the other thing that I think is fascinating is every time I give a talk and I take a few seconds to explain how the visualization works, I ask the audience, what is different about these diagrams? And even though it's really hard to articulate what do you think is normal or abnormal? Why did you get out these gashes? Why are the gashes so? We're forming mental models of what's normal and what's abnormal on Wikipedia, right as we are looking at these images, right? And that's because the visualization is showing us so much data that we're starting to wrap our minds around what might be normal, what might be a problem. So that to me says a lot. The final thing I want to show.
Before we do that, can anybody pull up that image?
Can anyone?
Could I pull up that image?
If you go to Wikipedia, you mean? No, unfortunately not. Wikipedia got in touch with us and they wanted to have this for every page, but they were worried about the burden on their servers. So we couldn't have this for every single page on Wikipedia, unfortunately. So the last thing I want to talk about is just a very different kind of phenomenon and a very different kind of visualization. So Martin and I were thinking about the weather because of one of Boston's winters. And we started thinking, what can we visualize about the weather? We started thinking about wind. It turns out the government makes amazing data about the wind available. The truth is that wind has been visualized for hundreds of years. So there's nothing new there. And it usually looks like this, a vector field where you aggregate a lot of data and you transform them into little arrows. It tends to be static, like this, and it does a fine job of showing you direction and speed. But we started thinking, is there anything different that we can do where we're really interested in the shape of these things, of the flow? Can we do anything different? And so based on that line of questioning, we came up with this, which is the wind map. And this is this is a website anyone can go to, and this is real time. So this is the wind right now. Around the US. So, and you can start playing with it. You can, move in here and see that things are very quiet in Boston right now. You can zoom out. You can see that there's interesting patterns along the Rockies here. There's broad strokes in the middle of the country. And then the other thing that's interesting is that it turns out the wind changes dramatically from day to day. And you have, days like these where Canada is stealing all of our air, and not even the mountains are stopping them from doing that, which is dramatic. Like, you usually don't get that. Usually the mountains are very clear. And then you get days like these. So this over here is Hurricane Isaac making landfall. And it was interesting because as this was happening, because it's real time, we started getting emails. So, people in New Orleans, we got this email, someone said, I'm here in New Orleans, I'm watching your visualization, and I'm just praying that this thing blows over us and is done. And so it was very powerful to have that kind of real-time exchange based on a visualization. And it wasn't until this guy happened, which was Hurricane Sandy, and we were in the path, that we realized how powerful this can be. So let me just show you a couple more things about the wind map and then move on. So the thing that's interesting, oops, let me just say one thing here. The thing that's interesting to me is that these maps use the same data. There's a lot of aggregation and simplification going on here on this kind of image, and there's a lot less going on here. So by allowing the image, the visual representation, to become more texture, and in a sense more complex, you get a completely different view of the same phenomenon, and you start being able to get these shapes and this gestalt that was hard to get. So it's almost like, when you have higher resolution images, it's sort of like this. Even though it's more complicated, all of a sudden you get it. You're like, oh my God, it does this? I didn't know.
No, we're going to have to wrap up.
Okay, all right, so I'm going to stop here.
Well, you
Can I say a couple more things? Okay, so just very quickly. The other thing that was interesting about this is we did this as a side project and feeling sort of geeky. Who cares about the wind? It turns out that all sorts of different communities care about the wind and started using the map in a very utilitarian way. So farmers, scientists, teachers, pilots, commercial and military pilots, to which we said, be careful, do not use the wind map. This is surface wind, do not do that. We actually put a disclaimer on our website, do not fly a plane, sailboat, or fight wildfires, because we got multiple emails about every one of these things. To which we got responses like, yeah, I see your disclaimer, but please respect the power of visualization in promoting the prevention of wildfires. So I will stop here.
The power of visualization.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, something I'm very interested in is the materials of design. So typically the materials of design are defined as form and function, and there is literally a materiality. People are talking about energy flows now. Things are moving much more social at this point. And in the room today, and I noticed there were a lot of materials missing today, or materials that were sort of unspoken: privilege, agency, externalities, all kinds of those. The transaction as a material. Joey talked about data as a material, and so I think for both of you, where I want to go is information as a material. And so this was popularized for me by Mike Kunievsky, who talked about information as a material, and that it has material properties. It's self-replicating, it's identical, it can sense, it can actually talk back. And that as a kind of material, information is a very different kind of material for designers, let's say, or social scientists to play with. So I was wondering if you could address how you're looking at information as a material, but in particular what you're working on like right now, and what's sort of keeping you up at night, or at least getting you up in the morning.
Okay.
So in terms of information as a material, I think for the work that Martin and I do, I think it makes it makes a big difference, the fact that we're working with data. So one of the things we will always do is we will always, for instance, not do anything until we have real data. So we might have all these intuitions and expectations and hopes for what the data might look like,
so
and what technique.
So authenticity would be a material.
Yes, but reality check, I would say it's even more of that. Like, you may think that you may want a visualization to look a certain way until you get real data. You don't know. So that's one of the things that I think is an interesting tension of doing this kind of work, is you're setting up this framework, you're setting up the rules in a sense, but the data is going to speak for itself, right? So it's really a partnership.
Scott?
Yes, I'm introducing an unfortunate acronym here. So when I teach this to undergraduates, I use DICWA. Is an acronym which stands for...
Very naughty.
It's naughty, right? But it stands for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. And the way we present this is we think of data as just the raw stuff that's out there, the bits. And the information, like with her beautiful maps, they're sort of taking that data and putting it in categories, putting it in some sort of usable form. And then the space I occupy, I teach these classes on modeling. And what models do is they take the information and sort of give you causal relationships or causal or functional understandings of how information relates to one another. So for example, let's suppose we're trying to understand something spatially. I might use Cartesian coordinates, sort of like x, y sort of things. I might also use polar coordinates, right, which has an angle and a radius. Those are two different ways of taking raw data and sort of turning them into information. Depending on the model I'm going to construct, if it's a rectilinear model, I'd use Cartesian. If it's a more circular model, I'd use polar. And things, these different ways of sort of turning data information give you different types of knowledge. Wisdom then, at least sort of within the Dikwa hierarchy, for what it's worth, means sort of having lots of knowledge and figuring out which one to apply when. But you can sort of only have lots of knowledge if you have lots of information, and lots of data doesn't guarantee lots of information. That's why I was so excited to be on the panel with her, because if you only have one way of seeing the data, that may not give you enough information. And so seeing things in different ways, tend to be really useful. I mean, I'll admit, like, I was raised in dynamical systems, so when I see those arrow maps, they make perfect sense to me. When I see your maps, I'm like, I don't know. Right? No, because I was trained in those.
Yeah, you know how to read them.
Yeah, I'm like thinking the derivative here must be twice the derivative of that one. Yeah, so.
That's interesting. So you're both involved in very dynamic systems and social science and lots of different kinds of science, lots of different kinds of social. And one of the things that I think is interesting and also a material for me as a design material is agenda. And that also has come up sort of sideways or maybe even under the rug today. And it's hard for me, and I think that there was a little pushback from the audience about this too, is like, this isn't agendaless. And I think it's easy to say, it's a comment like, I just make the machine, I'm not responsible for how it's used or who uses it. I think that the agenda needs to actually be baked into kind of everything. And what's interesting about your work, talking to you and researching, is the agenda is not obvious at the beginning. And in fact, I think both of you have made the argument that it doesn't help the work to decide what it's supposed to reveal. You just have to make stuff and then listen, or watch in your case.
Yes and no. So I'd say that, for instance, when we are sitting to do a scientific visualization, I think we approach it in a very different way than when we are doing a artistic visualization. The goals are slightly different. So for instance, with the Wikipedia work, it was very much a scientific endeavor. I was Martin's intern, and I had to write a paper at the end of this. And it was interesting. It was the first time someone visualized Wikipedia, right? So the trick there was finding these patterns that were repeatable and understanding whether or not what we were seeing on the visualization was generalizable. And so what we did, in addition to visualize and find these patterns, is we downloaded the entire website and ran statistical analyses of it, and then found that, yes, what we were seeing in the speed of fixing some of those things was true. It held for the entire website. So we would not do that on an artistic project. Does that make sense? So it's a different set of methodologies. Yeah.
Scott, can you talk about this maybe in relationship to your work with diversity and complexity?
I mean, it's a tough question, right? I think the thing is, when we think about, and this gets back to the sort of mechanistic versus complex system thing. When you think about, so big thing where I'm from in Ann Arbor and Detroit is the new Ford F-150, which I'm sure you're all excited about as well, because, it's an aluminum truck. And so the engineering side of having an aluminum truck, because you can't weld aluminum, right? You have to use rivets. So they had to train body shop people all over the country. But this was highly manufactured. You knew what was, they sort of knew what was going to happen, and they could command and control everything. And when I think about an agenda, this gets to the harnessing thing. Like if we say, let's create Bitcoin, this sort of government-free currency, well, there's a question what happens? Do people run up big Bitcoin bills? What happens to inequality? What happens to business cycles? What happens, we don't know. I mean, I'm reminded to pull back the phantom tow booth. There's a great moment where Tak and Milo are sitting in the car, and the car won't go, and the prince, I think of Digitopoulos, or maybe he's a Digitarian, comes over and he just says, just be quiet. And so they shut up and the car takes off because it goes without saying, right? And the same is true. I mean, this is, it's not true of the Bitcoin and the internet that it goes without saying, but there is this sort of what emerges, and it's much more complex than I think the standard sort of collective action problem. What emerges at the macro level comes from the aggregation of these individualized behaviors. But it's sort of what emerges, we don't know what it's going to be. So it doesn't go without acting. There's acting that takes place, but we're just not sure. So I was in Malaysia, this was I think 2 years ago, and there's not a lot of credit cards, right? And think about, but you just can't give everybody credit cards and hope that they're going to function properly with these things, because you might just create extreme poverty because people don't know how to handle, sort of an artificial currency. And so I think that one of the things that we all, we really want to think about is, and this is why people do natural experiments and stuff like that, is people are so hard to predict that and these things play out on so many dimensions. I think you've got to have maybe a degree of care that you might not have, within the context of a manufacturing operation. We think about sort of societal level changes.
Yeah, and I don't know about you, but I'm kind of dissatisfied today about like, ooh, and that's an interesting question, and that's an interesting question.
Right.
Yes, they're interesting questions.
Right.
No offense to the organizers, but it's just like, whose responsibility? What is the mandate? So for instance, well, I think we have to peel back the layers. So my understanding, the blockchain is what's important about Bitcoin.
Right.
And that Bitcoin is a great way to transact, but it's actually not a very good way to store the value of money because it goes up and down. And there are other dimensions to what makes currency currency. And it's interesting that you call it an artificial currency or
well, it's
something.
not.
No, but it's interesting that you said that, because I think that's going to be colloquially at least our initial understanding of like, oh, well, that's not real money. And in fact, who had said it this morning, like the digital transition's already happened. It's not like, well, when our lives are really digital. The story that I like to share is my daughter, she does like these YouTube like drawing tutorials where she draws like photorealistic eyes. And what's interesting is, I'll see Bronwyn doing it, and then immediately when it's done, she'll photograph it and post it on Instagram and watch likes and comments. And so the act of creation and the act of publishing are the same thing. I don't think that it would occur to her to actually do the drawing and not share it or publish it, but maybe most importantly, to get feedback on it. Nobody in human history ever had this tight a loop like that. And so what YouTube videos and Instagram have done is changed how kids learn how to draw, let's say. And so the inventors of Instagram are not going to have been able to predict that. Right. So we have this societal consequence that was, sort of startling and interesting and fascinating to me. That's an easy and maybe a fun one. There are lots that are like very not fun, very not easy either. So I wonder like where, what is the root of the agency? What is the blockchain of some of the other things that we've seen today? Maybe some people in the audience can respond. There was something else I wanted to ask. Fernando, you had talked about, or you had written, visualization brings less mediation between you and the raw data, which I was interested in, but you're also working on machine learning right now. And so we've heard the term black box come up a couple days, well, it seems like a long day. A couple days ago, yeah, wasn't that interesting? That you actually, it's like, well, we don't know how this works. And so you hear about this with algorithmic trading and like, sort of more and more contexts. And people seem to be okay with it because frankly, they have to be okay with it because this is where we are. What are your thoughts about like that in the current work that you're doing?
So we're starting to get interested in machine learning and how can visualization help us understand, and even the creators of machine learning systems better understand what's happening. It's talk about complicated and complex. There's actually the work of a professor here at MIT, Antonio Torralba, who I actually really admire in this field because he was the first person I saw who has been systematically been using visualization as a way to probe at what's happening. So he's the first one. Work from his group actually shows, in different layers of a deep learning network, what the computer is looking at when it's trying to understand photos, for instance. And it's really illuminating to see, oh, that's right, it's doing edge detection at the very first time, and then it's going...
Or what we understand as edge detection, right?
Yes, well, yeah, what looks to us like edge detection. And then, little by little, it's becoming more and more sophisticated in its understanding of scenes. And it was interesting because we had a conversation with him where he said, look, I don't believe in pushing this field forward unless you can understand what's going on. I feel like a lot of he feels like a lot of the progress stunning progress that has been made so far is sort of lucky because we don't really know why a lot of these things are working so well. And he's like, and eventually this is going to stop. We need to understand more deeply what's happening. And so hopefully visualization can help.
Yeah, I'm not sure eventually this is going to stop is going to be true, but yeah.
Let me play on this because I think this is, I mean, you're getting at, I think, what is a really interesting point. So in the past, when you have a model like force equals mass times acceleration, it does two things. It explains what's happening. We can understand it. It gives us understanding. And it also predicts, right? The bigger it is, the harder we throw it, the more damage it's going to do, as my son's figured out at a very early age. But the thing is now, when we do things like, we look at models of earthquakes, we have these plate tectonic models. They explain, but they can't predict at all. I mean, they can't tell us when it's going to happen. But then if we look at these black box models that we use for pattern recognition or stock prices and stuff like that, they can predict, but we can't explain at all because it's so complex. So we're stuck with, there's like this weird sort of trade-off. In order to explain, we have to predict. In order to predict, we have to sort of give up any understanding. So what they do is they try and insure against that by, having an out-of-sample and in-sample prediction, that sort of stuff. And they do these fancy, what they call bootstrapping and bagging things, where they pull out some of the data and construct a whole bunch of different models and average them and stuff like that. But the point is, you're sort of putting faith in statistics as opposed to faith in understanding. And this is where I think visualization is just, crucial. We want some understanding of what's going on.
There's a really interesting push and pull there. Before we open it up to questions, Frank Wilczek, who's I don't know if he's here. He's at MIT. Does he happen to be here? He wrote this great piece called 10 Lessons from the Standard Model. Reductionism Works is number one, which is really worth reading. It's just a paragraph. But then where I want to go is, a couple lessons down. He says, the Standard Model is best understood not as a list of particles, but as a realization of principles. That nature's basic operating system can be so understood in detail marks a profound revolution in natural philosophy. Through the piece, he actually admits how messy the thing still is. It's actually beautifully written. And so where I wanted to move before we open to questions is really this is about process versus product. We're calling them Knotty objects. Lots of people have commented that these are about flows. They're about often about mediation. They're about metabolisms. And so I wanted to sort of throw out a final thing that I think today really makes us understood something that I've been really trying to argue for a long time, which is that design is best understood as a verb and not as a noun. I think we really, really have moved to that moment where it was historically seen as something aesthetic that happens at the end. Now it's seen as something strategic that happens at the beginning, recently. And now I think it's the acknowledgement of the complexity that's making it interesting. And we had talked about sort of the tyranny of simplicity. It's just, like the tatting, right? It's like, well, everything's based on this one small thing. It's like, yes, it is. But like for me, like the gender and the hobby and all that, the mindfulness stuff, the complex stuff is what's interesting. And it sounds like for your work, that's true too. Is there something you can is there a way that you can express that idea that perhaps you share with students that in some sense maybe, if you're sort of resonating with this thought that you use to pass it along? I use noun and verb. Go.
30 seconds. You have 9 minutes and 4 seconds. We have questions in the audience.
No, I think that in the many years I've been in visualization, it's been great to see the tolerance that people have for complexity to go up. So it used to be that in journalism, you would never show a ton of numbers all at once because it could overwhelm your reader, right? Well, today, look at the New York Times. Look at all the newspapers who are putting out interactive graphics with tons of numbers, are modeling things. So I think this is wonderful because I think it starts to reflect the reality that life is complex, data is complex, and these are interesting interfaces in which you can start engaging with that complexity.
No, and the tip of the iceberg in terms of ethics and some of the other meta concerns that we've heard about all day. Scott?
Yeah, another thing I'd add is that I think, I was trained as initially sort of a mainstream economist, so the world kind of looks like this, right? Like we adjust something and Then we go from one equilibrium to a new one, and things are more efficient, and there's a tax versus a subsidy, and it's all wonderful, and we all get a B on the test. And I think the interesting thing, like in the thing that was written up about this and also in your presentation, is that now when I present, sort of when I think about an institution, whether it's a political institution or an economic institution, you're sort of setting up the rules, like setting up the rules for soccer. And then what emerges from that are all sorts of things like roles, artifacts, trust networks that Joy was talking about, all these other things that we sort of loosely put in as part of the larger culture aren't independent of the institutions we use to allocate goods and decide on political things. Right. And so when you say these are the rules, those rules are going to bring with them, or sort of at least maybe bring with them maybe too strong, but they're going to sort of ease or create pathways towards sort of certain collective cultural traits or roles or functions or artifacts that might not have been anticipated. So instead of just thinking about where does the equilibrium move, I think we want to ask, who will we become if we create this artifact, create this institution, create this thing?
As much as that's predictable as at all, because these things, they in some sense spontaneously or naturally create the infrastructure that allows them to exist.
Right.
And a lot of that is just not predictable. So let's throw it open here. Nicola?
Scott, actually, I was fascinated by what you said with complexity having a lot of big winners and a lot of big losers.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether that was generally known to be an inherent property of complexity, or whether it was something that gets set up in the rules at the beginning, and in fact whether you had any thoughts on how to create complexity without those kinds of inequalities, or whether that's possible.
Yeah, so one of the things, like if you take sort of a standard preferential attachment rule, which happens a lot so that if the probability somebody moves to a city is proportional to its size, or the probability that a member of a species gets reproduced is proportional to the size of the current number of those species. So think of there being a set of types, and the probability of getting a new member of a type is proportional to the current number of that type. If you let those systems go, you end up with what's called a power law distribution, where basically New York is twice the size of LA, which is twice the size of Chicago, which is twice the size of Phoenix, which is twice the size. And if the same's true, if you think of firm size, if the probability you buy from a firm is proportional to its size, then you'll get that Walmart is twice the size of Microsoft. And in fact, the firm size distribution and the city size distribution and species size distribution, those things have these long tails. And so I was at just a wonderful talk one time by Robert Johnson, who was the first black billionaire, I guess that's how he calls himself. And he said, when you start a business, you can't just open the yellow pages. You can't just sort of go to the biggest companies, because if you do, that promotes inequality. And I'm like, do you know about this power law stuff? And he's like, no, like explaining it to him. He's like, oh my God, that's exactly it, right? So I think the thing is, this is where you've got to think about changing behaviors. You've got to think about, that's why like the previous panel was so interesting to me. I mean, creating these things like Maker's Row, creating incentives, creating a culture where we say, no, I'm not going to buy that from Crate and Barrel. Sorry if you're in the, I'm going to go to someone who makes this by hand. That's an act of equality.
Yeah. Can somebody look this up? There's a great quote that design is where art and science break even. So beautiful.
Right.
I'm fascinated about there's this kind of weird tension in this panel coming as it does.
We love each other.
Bitcoin. Because it seems to me that Bitcoin is complicated, but it's not actually complex. The complexity is in fiat currency. The complexity is what you get when banks can create currency, when anybody can borrow currency, that people are doing all manner of weird financial innovations on their own, lots of different currencies in the world interacting with each other, and that Bitcoin is in many ways a reaction against that, and they've created a very simple mathematical problem, which is very you know how to solve it, and it's hard to solve it, and you can only spend it really one way, and you can only spend it once, and you can't borrow it, and we're radically simplifying rather than making things more complicated. So how have we managed?
You don't have to have a question. You can just
that's a good,
lay it out there.
Here, take a chair. Take this chair. No, I think that's a great point, right? I think that there's a certain gods must be crazy.
Now, only statements.
There's kind of a gods must be crazy aspect to it, right? You're just going to drop Bitcoin in and then see what the heck happens, right? And the thing is that it's a simple thing. It's like a Coke bottle. But it's the construction of it algorithmically. That you're right. That's a complicated process. But then there's a wonderful book called Biology's One True Law, which just basically says over time, ecological systems just become more complex, right? And I think the same is sort of true of social systems. So as you start throwing in more artifacts, people like the people in this room just start complexifying.
But you've also written that diversity, there's kind of a positive prejudice around diversity.
Oh, yeah,
it's
yeah,
not
yeah.
always better.
No, no, no.
Culturally, we have this idea that it's better.
It can be better.
Can be
Right,
better.
right, right. Can be worse. Yeah.
Now I have to turn this not into a question.
Okay.
So my question is, or my challenge is really about this idea of data as material. And I want to push back on this because I think there's been a tendency throughout the day to kind of cover over the messy political complexities of the sort of discourses in the fields that we're talking about here. And so my question, or my challenge would be, let's not think of data as material, let's think of data as politics, because that's what it is. It's politics. How data gets collected, by whom, for what reason, aggregated by whom, to what end, is a political process. It's imbued with a certain kinds of politics around agency, around access, around resources, et cetera. So what I would love to see is data visualization that is bidirectional, which is to say, not only do you take data and sort of smooth that over so that we can understand everything, we can see the patterns.
But you show its underlying force.
But also that we have then use that same visualization to reveal where that data comes from. Because if we don't understand that, what we're doing is we're accepting the lie that data is like the wind and it just blows through. And instead what we have to understand is all data is political.
Yeah, and not clean necessarily. Yeah. Thank you. No question necessary.
So no, but I have a
But a
comment.
response.
I have a
Not an
comment.
answer, a response.
So yeah, completely agreed. And so in speaking personally in our own work, we are huge believers on that. That's why we talk about data visualization as a medium, and as a medium where you're framing reality. It's really a framing of reality, right? So one of the things towards that end that we have done in our own practice, so back in 2007, we very much wanted to open up this notion of data visualization as this sort of technology that only experts could mess with or play with. And so we created this website called Mini Eyes, where anyone could upload data and create visualization publicly. And everything was, linked to its data source. You had to tell everybody where the data comes from.
Excuse me, it was a rule that it was going to be public. I remember going there and saying, oh, I'll try this out privately. And you're like, no. That's like the
oh, yeah, everything was public.
The price
from,
of admission.
Exactly.
It went public. That was fascinating.
And part of this was, it was an effort to democratize the technology and to start this debate about the fact that it is political and it is messy and it's not perfect and not only experts should be doing it. One of the things I thought were really interesting is when we first presented this at an academic conference, the top conference in information visualization, the reaction was half and half. Half of the room loved it and half of the room hated it. And they were saying things like, how dare you? How dare you put information visualization in the hands of anyone? What if people, they're going to be misinformed and they're not going to know how to use this technology? And to which our response was, let them play with it and learn and make mistakes and see how it's done. So it's very political, and even from the inside, there is this notion sometimes that it's too special to be shared or to be used by other people, to which
Again,
I don't.
It's a kind of privilege.
Yeah, which I don't subscribe to at all.
And whether it's intended to be political or not, it is. So one thing I often say when I talk to people in government is I say, don't mean what you say. And what I mean there is that with the other meaning of mean,
you can tweet that and then follow-up tweet.
No, they average. We get average statistics on everything. Don't just show means. I mean, the mean obscures so much, right? I mean, so our school performance looks kind of bad on average, but in fact, we have most students are doing really, really well. Almost all dropouts, come from like 10% of schools. So the mean is a really misleading statistic, and we've got so many ways to visualize what's going on that give us a sense of the full distribution, the richness of the American experience, the economic experience, the cultural experiences that people have, that meaning, though not meant to be political, sometimes showing the mean plays right, sometimes it shows left, but in either case, it distorts what's really going on and doesn't allow us to make policy or make decisions like we could. Right?
Thank you. Maybe don't mean what you say could be next year's theme. We'll see. We'll call pentagram. Yes.
Yeah.
Michael,
geez.
first, thank you very much. It was an amazing talk. And how do you take something complicated, but from within that seems extremely simple and able to calculate, such as Bitcoins, and throw it into a world that is extremely complex, and that introducing this new thing might make it more complex? So,
Well, and it's not in a vacuum either, right?
yeah. No, but I wanted to know if you think that we're simply going to adapt to this, or if what is going to change with this.
I don't know. I mean, I think that this is the thing. I mean, the one definition of complex is, right, difficult to explain, predict, and understand, right? So,
The three important things.
yeah, I mean, one of the things, though, that I think is intriguing. So Duncan Watts has this wonderful book called Everything is Obvious, then in parentheses, it's once you know the answer. So the funny thing about complex systems is whatever happens makes sense after the fact, right? And one thing we have to be sort of aware of is that somebody's probably going to have gotten it right. So Allan may get it right. He may give some answer here, and that can turn out to be correct, and then be like, he's a genius. But the fact is, there's probably a million stories in the naked city, and somebody's going to get it right. So whatever happens is going to be logical. So one thing you can do is you can sort of at least, and this is where the what is Linus Torvalds, with many eyeballs, all bugs are shallow in some sense. If you look at things in lots of ways, you're likely to get some sort of robust understanding of what might happen, right? And so this is where diversity is so important, because you want to have lots of people think about it. But you're never going to know for sure, but you can get an understanding of the range of the possible, I think.
I love the range of the possible, too. I guess the last question?
Amy
Or comment?
Or criticism?
Very, very brief of both. Amy Whitaker, I'm lucky to teach in Allan's program in New York, and I teach business to artists. So I just want to acknowledge that the whole day I've been thinking about economics and how economic systems have one metaphor that's linear, like a supply chain or an efficient assembly line, and another that's complex, like the coordination of systems to make a pencil. And I think the economics of information also comes up a lot in what you're saying, because sometimes you have to keep things secret in order, like in financial markets, for them to still be good ideas. So my question on the ethics point is, what is the responsibility of experts to help people understand the systems they participate in? Like, if you develop something amazing, but you're like, I don't know how it's going to get used, like, how well do I have to actually understand Bitcoin to use it?
Joe, you want that one?
Response from the audience. I love it.
I think that so one thing you can do, and Barabasi, who's here in Boston, he's at Northeastern, right? Not MIT, he's at Network. He'll do these things where he'll basically say, okay, draw the network, just as a first approximation, draw the network. So when I put the Bitcoin in this world, ask a bunch of people, what is it likely to be connected to? And the more things it's connected to, and the more potentially dangerous or productive that thing it's connected to, then the more you should sit around and worry about it.
I mean, how well do I have to understand a hash function, like the actual inner workings of it or not?
Probably not at all.
Yeah.
I don't understand my watch. So I think that, I think it.
I'm going to push back. Is the hot, raising the heat moderator? I think actually that you need to understand a lot of the complexities of what you use if it has consequence, and it is like partly, and maybe I can wrap things up with this. Yeah. I think that this is the scientists and the designers and the engineers and the journalists' job is to actually peel back enough onion skin to, honorably. Right. Express what the hell is going on in there and what it might mean if it's used effectively, if it's used appropriately, who decides what appropriate is, if it's abused, if it's stolen, if it's hacked. And I'm sorry, I want to end with this. We need to make things more complex. We need to be acknowledging the complexity of stuff, or we are we're not going to make it. Right. And so simplifying things and crystallizing things down to their truth, I think, is really anachronistic. I don't know if it was ever true. I don't think it's going to be useful going forward. I say embrace the complexity, own up to your responsibilities, build agency and agenda, transparent agenda into the artifacts that you make when you put them into the world, and please do that. And so huge thank you to my panel. Yeah. And thank you to the organizers. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to all of you. Thanks. Great.